I've been very concerned about the state budget, and I have been telling you that it is a time right now for bold and decisive action at the state level, to not stick your head in the sand. That would be to the governor and others, but rather the time to act. We know not exactly what's going on, but we know what's not going on. And here is one of the people who has advocated for a rational approach to all of this, Delegate Dave LaRocque, representing Virginia's 33rd District in the House, getting through the pandemic budget-wise. Dave LaRocque, welcome back to the Schilling Show. It's always good to have you with us.
Glad to be with you, Rob. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. So first of all, I want to step back for just a second from your perspective to ask you, I mean, no one could have envisioned this, but how prepared were we as a government for the situation at hand, knowing that unknown things can happen to us?
Well, we'll say somewhat. I don't want to say we weren't prepared. We have a cash reserve fund and a rainy day fund. Both of them were funded at significantly below the amounts that we're allowed to fund them by law. So we could be in much better position. And I think we're preparing to make a $600 million addition to the cash reserve fund. That's not likely to happen now. So no one anticipated this crisis and the depth. No one knows the duration of it. So in hindsight, we're way underprepared for something of this magnitude, and something that may last much longer than any crisis that we've seen in recent history.
Delegate LaRocque, I kind of think of the ant and the grasshopper, and I think of people, got all this money flowing in here. Let's just have a good time and spend and spend and spend. But I would imagine there were more rational voices in the conversation. I'm sure you were a part of it, who said, hey, put on the brakes here. And yet the people were just, enamored with the ability to all this money coming into the state. Let's find a way to spend it.
You're right, Rob. And I think even on the last day of session, when the budget was the last item, Steve Newman got up and said, wait a minute, we have a health crisis coming here, and this budget in no way anticipates that health crisis, the costs associated with it, or the effect it will have on revenues. And so the vote went ahead. The budget that projects, I think, roughly 17% increase in revenues over the next 3 years went forward. And so we're kind of in the worst possible position we could be with the current budget. Certainly can be fixed. But that, coupled with the legislation that passed, I think we were well on our way to making our business climate much less friendly for businesses, either the existing ones here or new ones that might come here. So it's kind of a perfect storm of bad events relating to business and the economy and state revenue. So as you say, we need to make some quick adjustments, and they need to be deep cuts and some other measures that will help us position ourselves better for this.
We're talking with Delegate Dave LaRocque, representing Virginia's 33rd District. So you have written an excellent piece on this, and I want to get into some of the things you brought up. And I think what's very important is to look, first of all, as you did, at historical context. And I guess we could go back to 82 and 2008 as well. What do we learn from those, and how do they compare with today?
Well, the numbers are really staggering. So not adjusting for population or anything, if you strictly look at the early 80s, the highest single week unemployment was a record-setting just under 700,000, I think 690 something in 1 week. And I'm sure that at the time that was just a staggering number of people to hit the become jobless in 1 week. We've had back-to-back record weeks here. 2 weeks ago, roughly, came in at 3.3 million. And then this most recent week at 6.6, I think, in round numbers. So close to 10 million people nationwide that have become unemployed in just a 2 week period, compared to a prior record of under 700,000 in the record that was before that. 160,000 of those people are right here in Virginia. And I think, sort of the curve, if there's a graph curve that we don't want to see spiking up, two of them, I guess. One would be the number of people that are affected by this virus, but this, we're almost going in a straight up curve with the unemployment numbers. And so that's just one of the indicators that is going to be directly connected to revenue or lack thereof. And, it's moving in the wrong direction, clearly, and may get worse.
Dave, let's talk about problems with the assumptions that this budget was based on, and particularly the growth rate, because that was pie in the sky, maybe even under good circumstances. But what did they estimate, and what's the reality?
Well, again, they estimated 17% total for the next 3 years. I think that Lane, a couple of weeks ago, was starting out saying that we might come up short $1 billion. Mm-hmm. I think that yesterday or the day before, Richmond Times-Dispatch covered a press conference, and that was upgraded to or changed to projection of $2 billion. Mm-hmm. But I think that's still very rosy. It's just, when people are out of work and the numbers are changing as quickly as they are, I think, the governor said yesterday he was going to time out the budget. And it's good to speak in terms that people understand, but and today he talked about pay cuts, not pay cuts, employment freezes and pay freezes and for state employees. And these are all good. They're definitely moving in the right direction. But there's a lot of discretionary or otherwise known as non-essential spending in the Virginia budget. And that has to be tied to revenue coming in as it comes in, as the revenue benchmarks are hit. If they're hit, then the money can go out. But quite honestly, I think non-essential spending is just going to have to be, really put on pause until we know the money's going to be there.
We've got a few minutes left with Delegate Dave LaRocque, Virginia 33rd District. We're talking about getting through this pandemic, especially budget-wise. So I thought it was interesting. I saw a story today that our two Democrat senators, Kaine and Warner, along with the congressional delegation of Democrats, are pushing the federal government to give them latitude in spending this money, which I think they'd love to use federal dollars to fund all of these frilly programs that they wanted to put into place. Do you see a danger there with opening that up the floodgates and letting them spend the money however they like?
I think anybody whose eyes were open and watched what Nancy Pelosi and company prioritized, abortion funding, money to museums and so on. Hey, let's be real. That there may be some distant connection that someone could make to that stuff, but that's not the kind of relief that businesses and people need now. It just shows how removed from reality they are. One of the other things, Rob, I know we're short on time.
No, we got some time. Take your time. I can stretch this a little bit. Yeah.
Just kind of switching back to Virginia a little bit, we're also asking the governor to reenact, meaning put on hold for this year, a number of measures that will raise the cost of living and the cost of doing business in Virginia. Mm-hmm. And given the circumstances, I think it would be very reasonable to request that, and I really hope he'll take that seriously. And nobody likes to give up their pet project, but I think in these crisis times that we really all need to be willing to make sacrifices for the good of the public, and I hope Democrats and Republicans are willing to do that. Otherwise, again, we were kind of rosy on the income projections. Mm-hmm. And what may have made sense, I'll take minimum wage, for example.
Yes.
If you liked minimum wage and maybe thought it was a good time to do it when we were going to have a 17% increase in revenues, mm-hmm. It's really time to rethink whether or not this is the time to do it. We need, certainly workers want protections, but if you're putting employers out of business, then everybody loses.
Yeah, I saw the Democrats responding to that, saying, well, this is just going to help people and it's going to pay them more, as if there's no effect or no side effect to the cost of labor to a business. And there are many particular retail businesses right now that are teetering. They're dangerously close to the edge. And I just don't see why they can't wake up to the reality, even though I know that's what they want to do. The reality is that policy is going to put people out of work and out of business.
Yeah, I think it depends. I ran a small business most of my life, and you're always looking for the downside, even in times when the economy is healthy. And if you're not accustomed to that, perhaps you've gotten a paycheck from a government entity for most of your life. I think you look at things a little differently. I know one of my fellow delegates runs a chain of small ice cream shops. And it was a week or so ago, he was contemplating whether or not to just go out of business. You just can't operate with no income and all the expenses that go with keeping your doors open and paying your employees when there's just no income. And that's the reality a lot of people are having to face. So piling more on in the way of regulations and taxes, we've got any number of bills that will increase electricity, cost of electricity. Those things just ought to be put on hold until we get back on our feet on the ground here.
We got just a couple minutes left, Dave. So let's talk about the timeline and the process here, because it's very important. And what is the inclusion of the members of the General Assembly in this process?
Well, the timeline is as of this Saturday. That's the governor's last opportunity to communicate his proposed amendments to the budget and to bills. And he is way behind schedule. There was a record number of bills, and he's been, releasing that. We've been tracking through the clerk's office, but I think he's communicated somewhere in the 600 range, and so that's in the time since he died several weeks ago, and he's got a few days left to go through a little more than half of the bills that he has to react to. I'd love to have him just put a reenactment clause on any of these bills that affect businesses and taxpayers, which means you take a look at them in a year and reassess. So that's the timeline. After that, they are going to we're going to presumably pass some sort of budget. It becomes very, very difficult to access things like reserves and rainy day funds if you don't have a budget to trigger the measures that give you access to those funds. So if anybody wants to communicate thoughts to the governor, encourage him to do some cutting or hold off on some of these bills, now is the time to do it. He's probably making his final decisions on them as we speak. And after that, I think, we wait. I believe Republicans are going to be very much in favor of taking a frugal approach to this budget. And I think we'll support any of the cuts he makes. The real question is, obviously, I'm not speaking officially for my fellow delegates,
yes,
but I think we just hope he makes them deep enough. And, beyond that, we wait for the real financial numbers to come in around the middle of the year. And if the governor that's when the rubber will really meet the road. And, we're a balanced budget state. You can't print money like the federal government.
Yes.
So if we run out, we've got reserves. If we run through our reserves, then we're in a pretty tight spot.
Indeed.
And, public employees and teachers and public service, law enforcement, they're accustomed to getting a paycheck, and we need to make the decisions that are necessary so they can keep getting their paychecks.
Indeed, we do. I'm so glad you're speaking out on this, Delegate Dave LaRocque. Thank you for always being on the forefront of common sense and for joining us today on The Schilling Show.
Always a pleasure, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. There is a good one. There are very few good ones, but there's one right there.